Hello everybody and welcome back to Microsoft Flight Simulator. Today we're going to be looking at the FSReborn FSR500. Now, this airplane is meant to be a replica of the Piper M500, and what's really cool about that for me is that I actually do Piper PA-46 flight instruction in the real world. I have been flight instructing in the PA-46 since 2021, and since then have accumulated more than 170 hours in the airplane, most of which has been in the piston models. However, I've also been fortunate enough to have a bit of time in the turbine models as well, primarily in the Meridian, which is the aircraft that preceded the M500 and eventually was rebranded and became the M500. So by no means do I claim to be an expert on this airplane. However, I do believe that my experience with it in the real world and the time that I've had in this one in the simulator qualifies me to give you guys some good insight on this aircraft from the perspective of a real world PA-46 instructor. So with that being said, today we're just going to be doing a nice, easy VFR flight offline from El Paso over to Odessa, Texas. And as we go, we'll be talking about the airplane and the different things that I've noticed about it, both good and bad, and just overall the things that I think need to be improved in order to make this airplane better. So without further ado, let's go ahead and climb up into the cockpit and get underway. Okay, welcome aboard the Piper M500 or the FSReborn FSR500. And as you can see, we're sitting behind the beautiful Garmin G1000 NXI. And one thing that I would like to make clear right away is that this video is a review of the FSReborn FSR500. It is not a review of the Working Title Simulations Garmin G1000 NXI. That is its own story that we're just not going to get into in this video. Now, one thing that you might have noticed already is that this airplane is missing the standby Aspen that is right here in the real airplane next to the PFD, and that is what's used as the standby flight instruments in the M500. It's not modeled in this airplane yet, however, it is planned for a future update, which will be really cool. And same thing with the Garmin GCU496 keypad right here. That is not currently modeled to be working, but it is planned for a future update. But other than that, you can see that the attention to detail in here in the interior is quite nice. I can't say that I'm the biggest fan of the straight up white interior, but it looks good as far as modeling goes and everything. And everything is modeled and working. All the window shades, you can open up the door from the inside if you would like. The table can come out, which is pretty cool. And then we can click it again to put it away. And all of these pillows back here are controlled on the cabin comfort page on the tablet, which I'll show you. But what's cool about them is the physics of them. They actually will move around in turbulence and with G-loads and things like that. But I'm not really concerned in a small GA airplane like this about running cabin comfort. If you look here on the tablet, you'll see cabin comfort, and you can actually provide cabin services to passengers that you might have on board and keep them happy and stuff. But again, that's not really what I'm after as far as the simulator goes in this airplane. So normally I just stow the pillows, and then you can look back here and they're put away. Now, as you can see on the tablet, you have all these different options of basically the status of the airplane and the things that you can control. I mean, you can control your settings from here. Frequently asked questions can be answered from here. You can adjust the level of realism that you want. This is where you can perform maintenance. I mean, the airplane's kind of like a living and breathing airplane, almost like an A2A aircraft. You can see that, the amount of hours that I have on the tack and everything as I've been flying the airplane. In your cabin comfort, like we looked at already, ground ops is really helpful. This is where you can fuel the airplane and put passengers and cargo in. I've already got it configured for today's flight. What I will do, though, is go ahead and remove the static elements. You can pull up different charts if you want to. You can import them from SimBrief if you use that, which is pretty cool. And then same thing with the flight plan. You can import that from SimBrief and have it all right here on your tablet. And then the pre-flight page, which is pretty much the extent of the pre-flight in this airplane. There's no actual walk-around pre-flight inspection modeled in it, at least right now. But here's where you can just see the status of everything in the airplane and just see that everything's indicating an okay status, which is good. So that's the tablet. We'll go ahead and put that away. And I think we are ready to go ahead and start running through our checklist and get underway. Now, I'm going to be using a M500 checklist that I use in flying the real airplane that I have pulled up. So I'm going to go and start running through that. So starting with the before engine start checklist. So pre-flight inspection is complete. Passenger briefing is not required. Cabin door latched for green. So if we go back here into the cabin, see we have our cabin door right here, and we have these green indicators right here. So I just want to make sure that I see 1, 2, 3, 4 green, which indicates that the cabin door is closed and latched. Pitot and static drain. So the real airplane has little buttons that are little drains right down here in front of the seats on both sides against this panel. They would be right here, and those are just little buttons that we press to ensure that there's no condensation or water or anything like that in the pitot and static system. And if there were, then we would drain it out right there. It's usually hardly anything, if anything, but we just want to make sure that they're drained, and there's a set of them on both sides for both sets of flight instruments. So we would just drain those at this time to make sure there was nothing in the pitot and static systems. Alternate static system primary. So again, the real airplane has an alternate static switch right down here below the panel. And we just want to make sure that it's in the primary position, which would be down. So that's good. Seats, seatbelts, and shoulder harnesses are adjusted and locked. All electrical switches are off. They're all off. Day-night switch is set in the day mode. Cabin climate controls are all off. Circuit breakers check all in. Now, one thing that is super cool about this plane is that all of the circuit breakers are completely modeled. I really like that. That is really cool. And so we just want to make sure that all the circuit breakers are in, and they are. Circuit breakers are all in on both sides. Perfect. Circuit breakers are checked. They're all in. Cabin pressure dump switch is normal right there. ECS is off. Bleed air is off. MOR lever is the manual override lever right down here next to the power lever. It is full aft and locked. Power control lever is at idle. Condition lever is cut off / feathered. And firewall shutoff valve is in and covered. Before engine start checklist is complete. Okay, engine start checklist. Brakes test and set. So we got good brakes, and we will set the parking brake. Battery switch on and allow the PFD to initialize. So PFD is coming alive, and it is initialized, and we're going to check our voltage. 25.4. That is plenty good for startup. Fire detection test. So I'm going to hold down the fire detection test button. You're going to notice an engine fire master warning right there in the CAS panel, as well as the alarm. So that's good. Coming overhead, we'll go strobe lights on. Nav lights are not required. Fuel pumps, manual. Ignition, manual. Prop area is clear. And let's go ahead and start it up, and I will walk you guys through this process. So, starter, engaged. NG is rising, waiting for it to come up and stabilize above 13%. And introduce the fuel. There's light off. ITT is rising. NG continues to rise. We have oil pressure. Monitoring that ITT for hot starts and the NG for hung starts. Everything's rising and back down now. Starter goes off at 50% in this airplane. That is not realistic. The real airplane, the starter goes off at 56%. And NG is stabilized above 60%. Prop is up above 1200 RPM. So that's a good start. Generator on. And check our volts and amps, look good, and alternator can come on. Now this is another thing that they got wrong in this airplane. In the real airplane, the generator is, when it's on and working, it picks up the entire load. The alternator is just a standby. The alternator only comes on when the generator either fails or is turned off. Now, as you can see in this airplane, they're both picking up the load right now. But in the real airplane, what we do is we turn the generator on, and then we turn the alternator on, but the generator is still the only one that's actually on. The alternator really is just on standby when I have that selected. All right, fuel pump switch goes to auto, ignition off, oil pressure, minimum 60 PSI. We've got really good oil pressure. And avionics can come on, and startup time note. Engine start checklist is complete. All right, tax checklist, go ahead and here, hit enter over there on the MFD. Fuel totalizer, check, that looks good. What I expect to have, wing flaps set for takeoff. We don't use flaps for normal takeoff in the Meridian, so flaps are all the way up. Cabin climate controls as desired. They're all good. Bleed air goes in. ECS goes to normal. Stall warning system tests.
Stall, 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 stall.
Good. Standby PFD check. At this point, we would check the standby Aspen right here, but again, that's not modeled yet, so won't worry about it. And we can get the weather here. Looking at ForeFlight, the wind is 310 at 13, gust 21, visibility 10, few clouds 25,000, temperature 19, dew point -04, altimeter's 2985. So 2985. 2985. 2985 is set. Elevation here is 3962, and we are within 75 feet of that. Altimeters are good. We have the weather. Clearance obtained and GPS nav set. So we're just going to be VFR direct. So I'm going to go ahead and come down here and put our flight plan in. All right, we have our flight plan in there, just direct from El Paso to Odessa. And we'll go ahead and go back to the map here. We can be arranged in nicely here for a safe taxi diagram on the MFD. So that looks good. Transponder set. Transponder, we go and squawk altitude, and we are squawking VFR. Transponder is set. And taxi lights on. So this brings me to my next point of something that they don't have correct on this airplane, and that is the taxi lights and the landing lights. So I want you to notice that this airplane has a landing light right here on the nose gear strut, and then it has taxi lights out here at the wingtips on both sides, there and there. Those lights out on the tips are the recognition lights or the taxi lights. This light right here is a landing light. So when I go to hit the taxi light, turn the taxi light on, the landing light comes on. That's not correct. In the real airplane, these two lights would come on solid, and then when I go to pulse, these lights will pulsate. Now, the landing light right here is only controlled by the landing light switch, which is right here in the real airplane. In this airplane, you'll notice that that's what turns on the taxi lights to their solid position. So they kind of had the landing and taxi lights a little bit backwards, but then it's thrown off a little bit by the pulse lights. The thing to know is that this switch controls the lights out on the wingtips, and this one controls the light on the nose strut. But with that being said, I'm going to operate it the same way that I would the real airplane. So at this point, we'll go taxi light on. So that's good. And we can release the brakes and check the brakes. So parking brake release. Put a little bit of power here, start rolling. Brakes are good. And we'll check the flight instruments as we taxi. We're gonna be taxiing to runway 26 left for departure. And I think we'll make a left downwind departure to the east. So brakes are good, flight instruments look good. Now, one thing that I do really like about this airplane in taxiing is they have simulated the effect of taxiing a turboprop very well. in a turboprop airplane, if you taxi at flight idle, that is too fast for taxi. The airplane will do 30-35 knots going down the taxiway. So what we do is we come down here to the power lever and put it in beta. You can see we're in beta right there, the cast message. And that allows for a much more realistic, much better taxi speed without having to drag the brakes. And they have simulated that very well in this airplane, and I really do like that. Alright, approaching runway 26 left, and we will hold short and do our before takeoff checklist. That looks good, so parking brake set, and before takeoff checklist, parking brake is set, flight controls free and correct. That aileron goes up, that one's down, that one goes up, that one goes down, and looking behind us, elevator up and down. And we'll check for full freedom of movement here on the flight controls. Controls are free and correct. Elevator and rudder trims set for takeoff. Elevator trim is in the neutral range, and rudder trim will go 3 degrees right for takeoff. Rudder trim is set. Flight instruments check and set. I don't see any red X's. Everything looks good, and we'll set them up. Runway heading is 265. We'll go and bug that. And we are VFR on our own, and today we're going to climb all the way up to 17.5. So we got that set in the altitude pre-selector. So that's all good. Flight instruments are checked and set. Power up to 1900 RPM. About 1900 RPM is set, and we're going to do the overspeed governor test. So see a drop in RPM there. That's perfect. And we'll do the reverse lockout test. So go ahead and press the reverse lockout button. And now on the real airplane, you have to hold down the reverse lockout button, wait so many seconds for the power lever to click. You'll feel the click in the power lever, and then at that point, you go to try to put it in beta in reverse, and it won't go. In this airplane, you just press the reverse lockout button, try to put it in beta in reverse, and it won't go. And in my opinion, that's actually not a bad way to model it in the simulator as far as the reverse lockout goes. And then we press the button again, you can see we can go back into beta if we would like. So that's good. Generator off. Now here is in the real airplane where we check the standby alternator, because if you think about it, the way that I started it up by turning on the generator, then the alternator, at this point we would have no idea whether or not that alternator was working. So here's where we check it, and you see when we turn off the generator, then the alternator would pick up the whole load like so, and we see that that's working properly. Then we turn the generator back on, and then we would come down here to make sure the alternator went back to 0 and the generator picks up the whole load, and our bolts are good. So that's our check for that. Quadrant friction lock is set. Fuel temp looks good. Cast panel is looking good for now. Radios are set. Again, we're flying offline, so I'm not really worried about it. Autopilot set for takeoff. Now, in the real airplane, what we do is we go down here and press the takeoff go around button there in the power lever. In this airplane, it's not modeled, so I don't worry about setting up the autopilot flight director for departure, because what that does is it brings up the flight director to a nice wings level climb attitude to pitch for on our initial departure. But we won't worry about that since it isn't modeled. Departure briefing, like I said, let's make a left downwind departure to the east. Once we're clear of the pattern, we will climb up to 17.5 and go direct Odessa. Now, my emergency briefing in the Meridian is as follows. First of all, I use what's called the 50-70 rule, which says that I need to have 70% of my takeoff speed, which is about 60 knots in this airplane, by the time I'm 50% of the way down the runway. Now, I generally, what I do is I pick a point approximately half of the way down the runway, whether it be a taxiway turnoff or a windsock or whatever it might be, to use as that 50% point down the runway. And generally I err on the side of safety. So for today, we're gonna say that I need to have 60 knots by the intersection of this taxiway right here. That's taxiway Victor. If I don't have 60 knots by Victor, we are going to abort the takeoff. Otherwise, we'll continue. If there's any kind of an engine problem on the departure, the most likely cause of an engine failure in any PT6 is the fuel controller, the fuel control unit. And that's why we have a manual override lever right here that overrides the fuel control unit. And this allows us to put raw fuel into the engine and use that just like a power lever if the fuel control unit goes. So the big question is, in this airplane especially, we don't have a prop lever. So in order to feather the prop, we have to actually kill the engine, cut off the condition lever in order for this airplane to be really useful as a glider, because with that thing feathered, it does about a 400 to 500 feet per minute gliding descent at best glide speed, which is 108. But with it at flight idle, not feathered, it'll descend at over 2,000 feet per minute. So my briefing for an engine failure is this: if anything happens on the runway, we're just going to shut it down on the runway, get on the brakes, and abort the takeoff. If something happens in the air below 1,000 feet, I'm going to reach over, pull the condition lever to cut off, pitch the airplane down to best glide speed, and pick my best landing spot, either outside of the windscreen or in front of the wings, off my left or right, depending on how much altitude we have to maneuver. If something happens above 1,000 feet, I would attempt to use the MOR lever to get us back to the airport. However, if it doesn't work, I wouldn't consider turning back to the airport until we're above 1,500 feet. And if it didn't work, we would, again, cut off the condition lever and pick our best landing spot below 1,500 feet, either to the left or right of me or in front of me, but not until we're above 1,500 feet would I consider making the turn back to the airport. So that's the emergency briefing. Tables and armrests stowed. My armrests are stowed and the table is stowed. And we are ready to go. We just have the runway items, which we do when we're cleared for takeoff. So let's go ahead and get going here. We'll go ahead and zoom this back out now and release the parking brake. Roll the airplane forward here. Verify clear left and clear right. We are cleared, and we are clear for takeoff, runway 26 left. So, runway items, fuel pumps, manual, ignition, manual, landing light on, pulse lights on, pitot heat on. That's all we need for anti-ice. That's good, and takeoff time note. All right, we are clear for takeoff, runway 26 left. Left downwind departure to the east. So we'll line it up here on 26 left. Holding the brakes. Bringing the power in. I'm gonna do a normal takeoff per the POH here, so takeoff power set before we release the brakes. That's good. Brakes released. Airspeed's alive. Engine's green and stable. There's 60 knots. We're going to continue. 80 knots. 85 knots. Rotate. Tap the brakes. Pause to rate. Gear up. Landing light off. climbing away. Now, the VY in a Meridian is 125 knots, both in the Meridian and the M500. And by default, they have it set on the airspeed tape as being 110 knots, and I forgot to change that before departure, and I'll explain that more here in just a moment. Starting our left crosswind turn here, we got plenty of altitude. Alright, left downwind here for our left downwind departure. Climb checklist. Landing gear is up, lights are out, landing light is off, wing flaps are up, climb power set, MCP, monitoring our torque, ITG and NG for our climb power, so that's good. Fuel pumps auto, ignition auto, engine instruments check. Everything is looking good and in the green. Good with all that. Airspeed 140 knots now for cruise climb. It's good. Pressurization system monitor. We are pressurizing. That looks good. Getting a cabin pressure differential. That's what we want. Recognition lights off above 10,000 feet. Ice protection is as required. That's good. And altimeters. We're not going to go high enough to go to standard altimeter setting, so don't need to worry about that. Climb checklist is complete, and we can go ahead and put ourselves direct Odessa, switch to nav mode. Flight level change, 140 knots, autopilot engaged. Alright, there's 10,000 feet, recognition lights can go off. And one thing that I forgot to talk about before we departed that I was going to is that by default, VY in this airplane, he has as 110 knots. Now, that is not correct. VY in a Meridian and an M500 is 125 knots. Now, VY in any of the piston models, whether it's the Mirage, the Malibu, the Matrix, is 110 knots. So he possibly mistakenly found the VY speed for a piston model and put that in here as the default VY speed. However, in the real airplane, it is 125 knots. So before every flight, what I've been doing is just manually going in and changing that. But, and I was going to do that before we departed and explain this, but I forgot. So there you go. Going back out of that. And we are well on our way to Odessa, climbing up to 17.5. Now, one other thing I wanted to highlight as we're still climbing out here is just how good the sounds are in this airplane. Both internal and external sounds, in my opinion, are absolutely amazing. I mean, I can't imagine how they could be any better. You know, both on startup, taxi, takeoff, climb, everything. I mean, I just think the sounds are really, really good, and I'm glad he got those. All right, altitude select, and we are leveling off at 17,500 feet. Now the first thing we do is we go and kill the yaw damper so we can reset the rudder trim for cruise flight. And I do that as the airplane is accelerating. All right, looks like we're gonna settle down right around 180 knots indicated. You can see I've got the slab centered right there. So my rudder trim is set. I'll go ahead and turn the yaw damper back on. And we're gonna go ahead and run the cruise checklist here. So cruise power set, I'm running 1,250 pounds of torque. That's keeping my ITT nice and cool. NG is plenty low, and our airspeed is below VMO. So that's good. Rudder trim is set. Engine instruments are all checked. That all looks good. pressurization system monitor, we are pressurized nicely, so that looks good. Ice equipment as required. We're good with just torpedo heat right now. And cabin climate controls as desired. Those are as desired. Cruise checklist is complete. Well, we're still cruising here. One thing I also wanted to point out was our ground speed. You can see we have a 43 knot tailwind drawing out at 145 knots. And that's giving us a ground speed of 291 knots right now. So we're absolutely screaming across West Texas. Now, the other thing that I want to do is go ahead and set up an approach into Odessa, so that I can show you guys one of the biggest problems that I have with this airplane, and that is the inaccuracy of the numbers when it comes to shooting instrument approaches. And I'll explain what that means when we do it, but I think we're going to go ahead and set up for the RNAV runway 29er approach. So go ahead and hit procedure, select approach. So we're going to do the RNAV runway 29er approach, starting from Wagbo is our initial approach fix. So we'll go ahead and enter that. Not worried about minimums. And we can go ahead and load that approach. Alright, we've got the approach loaded in there, so anytime I want to, I'll just go direct to Wagbo. And again, we're on our own, so we can just basically do what we want. The purpose of this approach, though, is just to show you guys the issue that I have with the numbers on the approach. So that's what we're going to do. Other than that, just going to be a VFR arrival into Odessa. I went ahead and cleared myself direct to Wagbo and gave myself the clearance to cross Wagbo at or above 5,000 and cleared for the RNAV runway 29er approach. So I have direct Wagbo in here. You can see our descent profile is set up, and we have a top descent here in about 8 minutes. Now, unfortunately, we cannot adjust that descent profile. You know, in the real airplane, we can adjust the vertical speed target and the flight path angle here, and then enter it, and it'll give you a new vertical speed required if you wanted to come down a little bit more shallow. But here you can see it doesn't do anything, and then I back out of it, it just defaults to 3 degrees. And the along track offset option is also not available. But like I said, this is not a review on the working title simulations G1000. This is about the airplane. So we're gonna do the best that we can. The other thing that I wanted to point out while we're still here in cruise is something else that they got wrong about this airplane, and that is down here on the airspeed indicator. You'll notice that we have a green arc, a yellow arc, and then the barber pole exists above that. That is not realistic. Turboprops don't actually have a yellow arc. They just have what's called BMO, which is a maximum operating speed. In the case of the Meridian, in the M500, it is 188 knots. So what that looks like on the airspeed tape is that we have a green arc all the way up to 188 knots, and then starting at 188 knots. Their barber pole exists above that. So that's something else that they got wrong. However, I operated the same way that I would the real airplane. We are about 1.5 minutes from top of descent. However, at 1 minute, we'll get our vertical speed required, and that's when I'm going to go and start down, just so I can shallow it out as much as possible, since we can't adjust our flight path angle or vertical speed target like I normally would to shallow it out in the real airplane. Real airplane, I would just set the vertical speed target to 1,000 feet per minute and have that ready for when we start down. We'll go over here to the altitude pre-selector and we'll put 5,000 feet in. 5,000 is set. And coming up on that 1 minute, we'll go vertical speed. And it looks like it's going to be about 1,300 feet per minute at least. And we're going to have to reduce power for sure. And we'll go and dial that, keep dialing that down. And monitoring our airspeed, and we are on our way down now. And we'll look at the descent checklist here. Seatbelts and shoulder harnesses are fastened. Power lever is set. Monitoring our airspeed. Ice protection equipment as desired. We're good with just the pitot heat still. Pressurization system verified. Destination elevation. That is good. Altimeters set, and we can go ahead and get the weather and set the altimeters. Weather in Odessa, wind 250 at 6, visibility 10, sky clear, temperature 27, dew point -3, altimeter is 2978, 2978, 2978, 2978. Altimeters are set. That looks good. We have the weather. Recognition lights, we'll get them on below 10,000 feet. In fact, I'll probably do it a little bit higher since we are at fairly high elevation. And avionics set, we are direct to WAGBO, so the approach is activated theoretically. So that looks good. We can shallow out our descent, looks like a little bit here, and bring a little bit more power back in. So descent checklist is complete. One other thing I wanted to talk about that, again, I think needs to be improved on in this airplane is the effect of going to flight idle in a turboprop. Now, the Meridian and the M500 and the M600 and the M700 do not have speed brakes. Now, the piston models generally had speed brakes. The M350 and the Mirages, generally you'll see them with speed brakes. We have a little switch right here on the yoke, and there's speed brakes that come up out of the wings and help us descend a little bit faster if we need to and slow down, because those airplanes are very slippery, and at idle they can glide very, very well. Now, the Meridian, when you go to flight idle, the prop acts like a speed brake, essentially, when you go to flight idle, and the airplane slows down very quickly. You know, in a Meridian, you can come across the threshold on landing at 95 knots and go power all the way to flight idle, and it'll slow down very quickly, and you won't have much of a float on landing. If you did that in a Mirage, you would be floating halfway down the runway easily, because the piston models are very airspeed sensitive, but the turbines are not as much, because again, you just go to flight idle, the propeller blades go flat essentially, and they act like a speed brake. That prop acts like a big speed brake, and the airplane slows down in a hurry. That's why in the real airplane, when you go to flight idle, you know, like we talked about on our emergency briefing, if we had a spool back, the decision needs to be made whether or not you cut off the condition lever or not, because at flight idle, this airplane is not an effective glider whatsoever. It'll come down at over 2,000 feet per minute at best glide speed. So that's an effect that they're missing, and you'll notice that on landing. You'll notice that I'll come across the threshold at 85, 90 knots and go power all the way to flight idle, and I'll still float for longer than the real airplane would, that's for sure. Now, as we continue descending towards Wagvo, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how I fly an instrument approach in the Meridian. So generally, my goal is to cross the initial approach fix at my numbers. What are the numbers, you ask? Well, the numbers are a specific set of airspeeds and power settings combined with specific configurations of the airplane that I use to fly VFR traffic patterns, instrument approaches, and in this case, we're going to be demonstrating them on the instrument approach. So generally, my goal is to descend down and level off a few miles before the initial approach fix so that I can slow down to my numbers and cross the initial approach fix at my numbers. Now, in the Meridian, those numbers are 125 knots with 10 degrees of flaps, which ends up being about 500 pounds of torque. Now, the problem that you'll see in this airplane is that the power setting to get 125 knots with 10 degrees of flaps is way off. And that is one of the biggest problems that I have with this airplane, because if you know me or if you've flown with me, especially if you've flown with me in the PA-46, you know that I am a numbers guy. I live and die by the numbers. I believe that the numbers provide for a consistent outcome. They make instrument approaches much easier. You're not wasting time hunting for what I call about airspeeds. Well, we want to be at about 120 knots or about 130 knots. No, I know exactly what airspeed I want to go to for the specific configuration that I'm in. Like, I know, when I know the numbers, I know exactly where I want to go, and it allows me to stay ahead of the airplane much easier. I'm at flight idle right now. This would be slowing the airplane down so fast in the real world. All right, but leveling off here at 5,000 feet, now we're in what we call the transition leg, where we're transitioning from our high-speed descent down to our approach speed. The goal is to cross the initial approach fix at that approach speed, our numbers like we talked about. So below 168, 10 degrees of flaps. Power in this airplane, I'm telling you, it's going to be about 270 to 280 pounds of torque, which is not realistic. Again, the real airplane, 500 pounds of torque with 10 degrees of flaps will almost always give you 125 knots, and that's what I like. Those are my numbers. But as you can see, it is going to be a much lower power setting in order to get that 125 knots. That's what I meant when I said the airplane is overpowered, because at 500 pounds of torque, we'd probably be doing 155 knots and not 125 knots. I mean, it's pretty bad when the check gear master caution is on while you're shooting an approach at 125 knots. That definitely should not be the case. All right, the approach is armed, so we will intercept the glide path, at which point we'll put the gear down and do the before landing checklist. But yeah, as you can see, it's just much too low of a power setting. This isn't really the best time to be demonstrating that, just because it is a little bit bumpy in here. We're getting some updrafts and downdrafts. As you can see, there's a downdraft, so bring in some power. But in the real airplane, again, 500 pounds of torque in this configuration will give you 125 knots. In the simulator, I found that it's about 280 pounds, which again is way too low. So there's glide path intercept, gear down. Oh, manual. Landing light on. And gears down, 3 green. Before landing checklist, wing flaps are set. They're at 10 degrees for now. That's good. Landing gear is down, 3 green. Landing lights on. Fuel pumps manual. Ignition is manual. Tables and armrests are stowed. Seatbelts and shoulder harnesses are fastened. Pressurization system, we are almost depressurized. That looks good. Autopilot and yaw damp will get before we land. We land, of course, rudder trim center. Rudder trim is centered, and brakes check. Brakes are checked. Before landing checklist is complete, besides the autopilot and yaw damper. Now, in the real plane, what we do is we fly 125 knots all the way down the final approach segment until we break out. And that could be all the way down to 200 feet. The purpose for that is because we don't want to become disorientated. We don't want to teach people to become disorientated, especially when they're in the soup. So we fly it the same all the way down the final approach segment there. All we did there was drop the landing gear. In the real airplane, we pull off 100 pounds of torque, and we come down the final approach segment at 125 knots, and it could even be all the way down to 200 feet, at which point we would just go power to idle, bring the flaps in, and the airplane will slow down, especially in meridian. Again, in the real plane, going to flight idle really slows you down in a hurry, and we'll slow down to 85 knots easily to cross the threshold. But in this airplane, that's not really possible to do because, again, they're missing the effect of going to flight idle. So because of that, we're gonna go ahead and kill the autopilot and yaw damper and start slowing it down further out, as if we broke out sooner, which we obviously did because we're completely visual. Below 135, flaps 20. And before landing checklist is complete, we're clear to land. Gear is down, 3 green. And below 118, full flaps. Full flaps. Looking good on the approach here. Airspeed's 96. Slowing it down a little bit of a crosswind from the left, you'll notice. So add a little bit of left rudder, or right rudder, left aileron for our side slip there. Airspeed's 88. Looking good. Power all the way to flight idle. Bring it down into the round out and let it settle into the flare. Look at that float. I mean, the real airplane would slow down so fast after I went to flight idle. There we are, and center our feet before the nose wheel touches, and reverse thrust. Alright, and let's go ahead and turn left on runway 16, and then we'll take it down to Charlie and do the after landing checklist. Alright, we'll get the entire airplane clear of the runway, like so, and look at the after landing checklist. Landing time is noted. Fuel pump switch goes to auto, ignition off, ice protection equipment all off, weather radar is off, we didn't use it, landing and taxi lights as required, we'll go back to taxi, landing light off, wing flaps identified, flaps coming up, flaps are selected up, and trims set for the next takeoff. Go ahead and set our elevator trim here to the center of the neutral range and back to 3 degrees right on the rudder. That looks good. After landing checklist is complete. Alright, here's our ramp. We'll go ahead and pull it on in here. Parking the airplane as much into the wind as possible. It's always a good idea for a turboprop. And we'll go ahead and set the parking brake here. That looks good. and do the shutdown checklist. So parking brake is set, landing and taxi lights are off, ECS switch goes off, power lever is at idle, cabin climate controls are all off, fuel pumps switch goes off, avionics off, alternator off, generator off, condition lever go cut off, bleed air off, alright, nav lights are off, strobe lights off, battery switch off, and standby PFD verify is off, and shutdown time note. Well guys, we made it to Odessa, Texas, and I really hope you enjoyed this flight and this review of the FSR500. I must say, for the most part, I really like this airplane. It is by far the best PA-46 I have flown on an at-home flight simulator. I've really enjoyed flying it, been flying it a lot on VATSIM, doing some live streams and stuff, which has been a lot of fun. I just think if they could work on those things that we talked about today, it would make this airplane that much more realistic and that much better. But overall, I must say I am really excited about this project and can't wait for future updates and to see where it goes. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys sometime soon. Take care.